Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 63 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Ottawa Senators, in which the Sharks have won 2-1. And while this may be the 63rd game of the regular season, it is the first game of the post-Tomas Hertl era here for the San Jose Sharks, and this really makes you realize just how far away and how far the Sharks have come in just a short 5-year period from being that perennial Stanley Cup contender to now being a perennial basement-dwelling team in the NHL, smack dab in the middle of a rebuild. Some would even describe it as right at the beginning of a rebuild. Hertl was one of the 3 remaining players on the Sharks roster who actually played with the Sharks the last time they made the playoffs back in 18-19. But now with Hertl having been traded to Vegas and Couture out of the lineup indefinitely, it only remains as Marc-Edouard Vlasic, the holdover player from the more happy times, I guess you could describe it, for the San Jose Sharks. And yet when we circle back to tonight's game against Ottawa, the San Jose Sharks, with the news and the sadness and the despair from yesterday's trade by Mike Grier giving Tomas Hertl to the Vegas Golden Knights, the Sharks yet managed to rally around perhaps their young goaltender looking for his first career NHL victory and come out here tonight against the Ottawa Senators and actually put up a solid performance and get the win. With this victory, it actually avoids a third time this season in which the Sharks would have lost 10 games in a row, which I don't think that's an NHL record, but it probably is up there in the record books as being like a terrible thing to have had happen. But the Sharks, they avoid it with this 2-1 victory. Nice to see for sure. In the first period, the Sharks actually start off rather well. They're really taking it to Ottawa, getting some good chances, but then they end up taking a penalty, which allows the Senators to claw back into this one, get a bunch of shots for themselves, and while they wouldn't end up scoring, it made them able to carry momentum forward and definitely made it so it was a relatively even last part of that first period. However, the Sharks would be the only team to get on the board in that opening frame, coming from Thomas Bordeleau, a second straight game where he scores, a second straight game in which it's on the power play, and a second straight game where it is the same style of goal. Bordeleau standing right in front of the net, the puck happens to hit off of his leg and goes in. Nice to see, and as per usual, you can just give the classic idiom of it's gotta be good to be lucky, you gotta be lucky to be good, whatever you might say, but it's still nice to see Bordeleau in just his second game here since being called up, managing to score his second goal. In the second period, the game would be tied up by the Senators with a goal from Tim Stützle also on the power play. Remember, Tim Stützle was the first-round draft pick of the Ottawa Senators in 2020, third overall, in fact, in a draft pick acquired from the San Jose Sharks in the Erik Karlsson trade. And because the Sharks absolutely imploded in that 1920 season, this ended up being a third overall pick. So definitely a big loss for San Jose, considering he ends up sort of in hindsight being the best player drafted in that 2020 draft. The Sharks losing out on him, the Senators getting him, and he helps tie this game up at 1. But then a few minutes later, it is yet another power play goal and yet another one from Thomas Bordeleau. Guess who? His 4th of the season in just 8 short games that he has managed to play. So definitely contributing when he has been in the lineup, and it was just generally a great game for Bordeleau for sure. And this also ends up being the game winner of the night, because there would be no more scoring in the second period, and in the third, while there would be some chances, the Senators would even pull their goaltender at the end, no goals would go down in the last 20 minutes, and as such, it is a 2-1 victory for San Jose. Like I said, they managed to avoid the 10-game losing streak for the third time this season. What this does do, however, with this regulation victory is get the Sharks 2 points in the standings. Elsewhere in the NHL, the Chicago Blackhawks were in action and they lost to the Washington Capitals, which means the Sharks continue to expand on their lead over Chicago, further solidifying the potential finish of 31st in the league. Nothing is set in stone just yet. There's still 19 games remaining to be played, and you never know just how many of those the Sharks could end up losing. But at the same time, the Blackhawks, also a very bad team, could end up losing just as many as San Jose. So it's going to be tough to get that last place spot at this point. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Granlund and Zetterlund, this time being joined by Barabanov. A couple of games ago, they were joined by Anthony Duclair for the last and final time before being traded to the Tampa Bay Lightning. Then last game against the Islanders, they were joined by Thomas Bordeleau, at least at the start of that game. And here tonight, with Barabanov having survived the trade deadline because of the fact that Tomas Hertl was used as the final retention slot that the Sharks had access to, and because of the fact that Barabanov has not been good this season, they could not find a suitable trade partner who would be willing to take on the entirety of his contract. So he remains with San Jose. His motivation now at this point is to try and play as well as he can at the end of this season to try and get himself another contract with a different team during free agency of this offseason. And I thought Barabanov was decent enough here tonight. He's definitely had worse games this season, but he's also had a couple of better ones. A few good shifts here or there where he made some solid plays, but it is the same factors that have remained constantly for Barabanov this season. Relatively slow on the puck, only really looks interested when he's in the play offensively, and sometimes not even looking particularly interested if he's away from the puck itself, which has been just slightly disappointing to see throughout the entirety of this season. But when he does have it, he can make some good things happen, and I thought he did that here tonight. The same would go for both Granlund and Zetterlund. They were not particularly good in the previous game against the New York Islanders. They do rebound substantially here tonight. I thought Granlund had a pretty solid game, and so did Zetterlund. When it comes to the second line, we have Eklund, Zadina, and Luke Kunin. So we saw Eklund get a stint back at the wing near the end of the New York Islanders game where he got bumped up to the top line with Granlund and Zetterlund. He goes right back here as a centerman position here on the second line. And while I do respect Eklund's defensive performance here tonight, I actually thought it was quite good, which is something I've been critical of recently when it comes to William Eklund. From an offensive standpoint, this second line was definitely one of the weaker ones for San Jose, really just not doing much of anything. It felt as though Eklund was kind of making multiple uncharacteristic mistakes, not necessarily in terms of turning over the puck to the Senators or anything of that nature, but more so just bobbling pucks, miscued passes, kind of like passes off the boards where previously in other games he would have managed to hit his man perfectly, but this time it would be just barely ahead of them, and so it would end up just going off for a change and ending up being another shift going through the neutral zone, things of that nature. So definitely slightly disappointing for Eklund from an offensive perspective, but defensively I thought he did some really good things, and the same would have to go to both of his wingers here, Zadina and Kunin. Zadina had like one solid offensive moment here tonight, otherwise there really wasn't all that much doing. Kunin not even having that one offensive moment, he was just kind of middle of the pack for the entirety of this game. Then we get to the third line for the Sharks. This, Sturm, Hoffman, and Bordeleau. So as we know, at the end of the Islanders game, the Sharks did some lineup juggling. This was one of the lines that was put together and is the only one that actually stays from game to game. And this was a very good choice by David Quinn for sure. Actually, no, I guess maybe this one wasn't the line that stayed. I don't recall exactly, but it ends up being Sturm, Hoffman, and Bordeleau here tonight, and they looked quite good, even at even strength. Obviously, you talk about Bordeleau here with his 2 power play goals, very impressive, but his even strength performances were also quite good, and I was happy with Bordeleau's performance in the previous game against the New York Islanders for sure from an offensive perspective, but from a defensive perspective, he struggled immensely. Here tonight, he really wasn't forced to play defensively all that much. He rarely had a defensive zone shift, occasionally for sure, and I thought he looked decent enough, but there weren't too many times where he had to go for that big back check, going straight down the ice through the neutral zone, anything like that. There were not too many moments of this nature, and so you didn't really get to see if he improved a ton on his mistakes that he was making in the previous game, but the focus more offensively, Bordeleau was one of the better players for the San Jose Sharks. He was doing a ton of great things in the offensive zone, perhaps even could have had a hat trick, potentially on the Sharks 5-on-3 that they got for about 30 seconds against Ottawa, but unfortunately it would not come. But definitely really good game for Bordeleau, certainly earns him yet another look next game. When it comes to the other 2 players here, the one who really stood out for me is Mike Hoffman. Hoffman has been really hit or miss for pretty much the entirety of this season, but especially as of late, it feels as though he will have like a really solid game where he looks quite engaged, and then immediately after that he just has like the worst game ever, and you're like, why is this guy even playing NHL hockey? Here tonight, it was one of those good games. Hoffman making some really slick plays in the offensive zone. That's really his strength for whatever reason it seems. You know, he was very much advertised as a shooter first mentality. He'd plant himself in one place in the offensive zone and just fire off one-timers, and we have seen that over the past few games and the entirety of this season. But where he really excelled at in particular in this game was making those slick passing plays, in particular with Thomas Bordeleau. Nico Sturm was kind of the odd man out a bit on this line, still got the benefits. He had a couple of really good chances even in the early parts of the first period from some good behind the net passes from Bordeleau, but didn't exactly have that same offensive flair as the two other players on his line. When it comes to the fourth line, we had Carpenter and Bailey being joined by the newest San Jose Sharks, or one of the newest San Jose Sharks, Klim Kostin. So he ends up replacing Giovanni Smith on this fourth line, which was slightly disappointing to see because Smith really had his first good game of the season practically in the previous one against the New York Islanders. But I guess you want to get Kostin a run here. Makes sense for sure. And he didn't really do much of anything. This fourth line was extremely muted. They pretty much had nothing happen. There was one chance in the offensive zone that did come kind of close. I will give them that. But Kostin himself didn't really factor in too much on that particular play. The only real standout of Kostin's game was the penalty he took, which is obviously not a very good thing. And then otherwise, Carpenter Bailey, very much a just sort of basic mid-level performance from them. Then we get to defensively the top pairing of Ferraro and Burrows here. So Burrows jumps up immediately to the top pairing. This is because Jan Ruda was the odd man out here tonight. I believe an injury, or at least I would imagine an injury. Ferraro and Burrows, I thought, played rather well. There were a few small hiccups, kind of like what I mentioned with William Eklund, where they just kind of had moments where it just didn't seem entirely on the ball, where they would overskate with the puck or they'd have the puck bobble over their stick, and you would hope they would be slightly more focused than that. But I'd say in the general sense, I thought they played rather well defensively. There were some solid chances for the Senators this game, but they were pretty few and far between, and that does definitely give some credit to the Sharks defensive core, who compared to the previous game against the New York Islanders were significantly better here tonight. When it comes to the second pairing, we do have Vlasic and Thrun. These guys, I would say, a step below Ferraro and Burrows for sure. In particular, Mark Edward Vlasic, again, not necessarily having the best of games, but I'd say it was definitely a rebound from the previous game against the New York Islanders, so that's a good thing. Thrun himself, as per usual, it feels as though you're just kind of flipping a coin every single time Thrun steps out on the ice, whether or not you're going to get one of those really good shifts where he's making some strong plays and making those great first passes out of the zone, or you're going to make those, or you're going to get a shift in which he's just giving the puck away over and over and over again. And so when it comes to Thrun, I thought generally a positive game in the whole, but you would still like it to have a certain level of consistency there for sure. And then when it comes to the final pairing, we have Addison being joined by Jacob McDonald. So with the trade of Nikita Hotyuk yesterday during the trade deadline, the Sharks lost out on their seventh defenseman in that situation, so they call back up McDonald, who had been relatively recently sent down to the Barracuda in the AHL, and I actually thought McDonald had a really good game. I was extremely impressed, in particular with his offensive output here tonight. Obviously there's no goals or anything like that, but he was doing a great job of reading plays well. He was doing some solid shot passes, some great keep-ins at the blue line as well. He kind of reminded me, this is the comparison that I took of him last season, of like a sort of Erik Karlsson light, and when I use light, I put a lot of emphasis on that word because obviously he's nowhere near the skill level of Erik Karlsson, but he reminds me a lot of him in that sense where he has those smart offensive instincts, but defensively, there are definitely those major issues where he kind of just plants himself in one spot. He's not necessarily going for those crazy board battles where you're expecting him to be in that for like 20 seconds. He's not really being activating in front of the net or anything of that nature. He's kind of always looking to make it moving forward offensively, which I don't think is necessarily a horrible thing, even if it's not an amazing thing. And I'd say generally he had a pretty good game here tonight for the Sharks, for sure. And then finally we have the goaltender for San Jose. That would be Magnus Krona. He's been extremely off and on and off and on. He's had 4 starts now on the season, a terrible one against the Edmonton Oilers, then a very good one against the Dallas Stars, then a terrible one against the New York Islanders, and here tonight a very good one against the Ottawa Senators. A big reason for why the Sharks managed to win this game, obviously the defense in front of him was doing some good things for him, but it is primarily the goaltender who is your last line of defense, giving up only a single goal here tonight to a Senators team who does have issues defensively. They're near the bottom of the standings, but from an offensive standpoint, they can be a pretty high-scoring team at times, and so solid game for Krona for sure, and credit to him as well. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will be taking on the Philadelphia Flyers as they head back to the East Coast for this road trip. And we shall see if the San Jose Sharks can keep the good vibes rolling in the post-Hurdle era, or if they will go right back to losing. Class dismissed.